January 17, 1944, somewhere over the frozen plains of Brandenburg, Germany. The air at 25,000 feet burns cold enough to crack exposed skin. Frost creeps across the canopy glass like skeletal fingers. Beneath the thin aluminum skin of a Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, Oberleutnant Klaus Becker scans the horizon through goggles already fogging at the edges. His breath comes in shallow bursts, rationed like everything else in the Reich these days: fuel, ammunition, hope. Below, the patchwork farmland of eastern Germany stretches white and silent, a quilt of snow-dusted fields interrupted only by the dark veins of roads leading toward Berlin. The capital lies 60 kilometers west, hidden beneath winter clouds that promise more snow by evening. Then he sees them. Black specks emerging from the sun's glare, high and distant. American bombers. B-flying fortresses, probably. Maybe B-24 liberators. It doesn't matter. What matters is the absence. For 18 months since the Americans began their daylight raids over the Reich, Becker and his fellow Jagdflieger have grown accustomed to a certain rhythm of engagement. The bombers come in their boxes, bristling with guns, bleeding fire and metal across the sky. German fighters rise to meet them, slashing through defensive formations, accepting losses but always safe in one fundamental certainty. The Americans come alone. Their escort fighters, the stubby P-47 Thunderbolts and the aging P-38 Lightnings, turn back at the German border. Fuel, range, physics, the mathematics of war favor the defender. Every German pilot knows this equation by heart. Fight hard until the escorts turn for home, then methodically tear apart the bombers at leisure. But today, something is wrong. Becker's radio crackles. A voice tight with confusion reports contact. Not bombers, fighters, American fighters here, over Brandenburg. Impossible. Becker checks his fuel gauge out of instinct, calculating distances, burn rates. No American fighter has the range to reach this far into Germany. No American fighter should exist this deep in the Reich. Yet the contacts multiply on the radio net. Multiple bogies. Single engine. Fast. And then someone says something that makes Becker's stomach tight beneath his leather. They're not turning back. The escorts are still here, still climbing, still hunting. Becker pushes his throttle forward and begins his dive, the Messerschmitt's Daimler-Benz engine howling its familiar song of supercharged fury. 24 months ago, this would have been routine. German pilots owned the skies of Europe. The Bf 109 and its stablemate, the Focke-Wulf 190, represented the pinnacle of fighter design: fast, maneuverable, deadly. When the Americans first appeared with their bomber streams, Luftwaffe commanders watched with something approaching contempt. American pilots were poorly trained. American tactics were rigid. American fighters were adequate at best, mediocre at worst. The P-39 Airacobra had been a joke. The P-40 Warhawk was obsolete before it reached operational status. Even the vaunted P-47 Thunderbolt, for all its ruggedness, was too heavy to dogfight effectively and too short-range to matter. And then there was that other one. The one they'd laughed about in the ready rooms at Wiesbaden and Schiphol. The North American P-51. The name itself invited mockery. North American Aviation, a company that had built trainers and liaison aircraft. Not fighters. Not real fighters. When intelligence reports first described the P-51, Luftwaffe pilots shared cigarettes and dismissive smiles. The British had ordered it in desperation, they heard, and the Americans had cobbled it together from salvaged ideas and borrowed parts. Early models used Allison engines, the same power plant that had hobbled the P-40. Performance at altitude was reportedly dismal. Armament was light. The consensus among German fighter pilots was clear. The P-51 was a stopgap measure, a placeholder until the Americans could copy something German and call it their own. Becker had seen a few of them in combat during the autumn of 1943. They looked fast, he'd admitted privately, with their smooth lines and laminar flow wings. But fast in a straight line meant little in combat. Dogfighting required more than speed. It required power-to-weight ratios, roll rates, turning radius, climb performance. The P-51s he'd encountered had been easy to evade, unable to compete at higher altitudes where the Bf-109 excelled. He'd even downed one in October, a quick burst from his 20 cannon, the American fighter trailing smoke before spinning away into cloud. Just another kill marking stenciled beneath his canopy. But the aircraft he sees now, closing fast from his 2 o'clock high, is different. The silhouette is familiar, that distinctive bubble canopy, the scoop-like air intake beneath the fuselage, the sleek nose. But something fundamental has changed. This P-51 moves differently, climbs differently. The way it slashes across his vector, cutting angle with an ease that makes his pulse spike. This is not the underpowered Allison-equipped variant he'd faced before. This is something new. This is the Merlin. History will record that the marriage of North American Aviation's P-51 Mustang airframe with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, or rather its American-built Packard license copy, represents one of the most consequential decisions of the Second World War. But in January 1944, as Klaus Becker snaps his Messerschmitt into a hard climbing turn, history is still being written in gun camera footage and loss reports, and the sudden, creeping realization that the rules have changed. The P-51B, powered by the Packard V-1653 Merlin engine producing 1,490 horsepower, possesses capabilities that invalidate 2 years of Luftwaffe tactical doctrine. Its maximum speed exceeds 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, faster than the Bf-109G6, faster than the FW-190A8, fast enough to choose when to fight and when to disengage. Its service ceiling reaches 41,900 feet, giving it altitude superiority over virtually every German fighter in operational service. But the real revolution, the true paradigm shift, is range. With internal fuel and 2 75-gallon drop tanks, the P-51B can escort bombers to Berlin and beyond, 300 miles combat radius. Berlin, Prague, Vienna. The industrial heart of the Reich, previously shielded by distance, but Becker doesn't know all this yet. He only knows that the American fighter pursuing him should not exist this far east, should not be accelerating so aggressively in thin air at this altitude, should not be closing the gap. He rolls inverted and pulls, a classic defensive split-S maneuver that has saved his life a dozen times. The Messerschmitt responds instantly. One advantage of German engineering, that crisp, immediate control response. Gravity adds energy as he plummets toward Earth, airspeed building, the altimeter unwinding through 15,000 feet. He plans to level out low, use ground effect and terrain masking, force the American into a stern chase where the Bf-109's lighter weight might offer advantage. But when he levels at 8,000 feet and cranes his neck to look behind him, the P-51 is still there, still closing. The American pilot hasn't fallen for the bait, hasn't overcommitted. Instead, he's matched Becker's dive with patient precision, maintaining energy, waiting for the right moment. This is not the behavior of an inexperienced pilot flying an inferior machine. Becker's wingman calls a warning, another P-51 diving in from above. Becker brakes hard left, pulling until gray edges creep into his vision, but the Mustang follows through the turn without apparent effort. The two aircraft spiral downward in a vertical scissors, each pilot trying to force the other to overshoot. Becker's breathing comes in gasps now, the G-forces crushing his chest, his vision tunneling. He's fought Spitfires over England, Yaks over Russia, every breed of Allied fighter in every corner of the Reich. He knows his aircraft's strengths. The Bf-109 can outturn most opponents at lower speeds. It can dive away from trouble. It can climb better than almost anything except specialized interceptors. But this American fighter matches him move for move. When Becker tries to climb away, the P-51 follows, its Merlin engine gulping the thin air and transforming it into thrust. When he dives, the American dives faster, the Mustang's laminar flow wing design reducing drag to levels German engineers never achieved. When he turns, the P-51 turns inside him, pulling lead for a deflection shot. Becker sees tracer fire arc past his canopy, 50 caliber rounds, his left wing punching holes through aluminum skin. His aircraft shudders, oil temperature spikes. He runs. It's not a word any fighter pilot wants to associate with their actions. Not Germans. Not the heirs of Richthofen and Bolk, the masters of aerial combat doctrine. But Becker pushes his throttle through the gate into emergency power and points his nose west, running for home. Behind him, the P-51 gives chase for 30 seconds, 40, a minute, far longer than any American fighter has pursued him before. Then, mercifully, it breaks off. Becker doesn't feel relief. He feels something colder. Something that tastes like the beginning of an ending. By the time he lands at Salzwedel, nursing his damaged 109 onto the runway with smoke trailing from his engine cowling, reports are flooding into Luftwaffe headquarters from across northern Germany. American fighters, long-range fighters, engaging Bf-109s and FW-190s as far east as the Oder River. Not P-47s, not P-38s, a new type, faster, longer-ranged, deadlier. The P-51 Mustang has arrived over Germany, and the laughter has stopped. To understand why German pilots initially dismissed the Mustang, one must understand the intoxicating hubris born from 3 years of aerial dominance. When the Luftwaffe's Bf-109 entered service in 1937, it represented a quantum leap in fighter design. An all-metal monoplane with a retractable undercarriage, an enclosed cockpit, and performance that humiliated every biplane opponent it faced. During the Spanish Civil War, Bf-109s established air superiority with casual ease. In the opening years of World War II, German fighters swept aside Polish PZLs, French Morans, and British Hurricanes. Even the Supermarine Spitfire, Britain's finest fighter, fought the Bf-109 to rough parity at best. By 1942, Luftwaffe pilots had every reason to believe their aircraft and tactics were superior to anything the Allies could field. American fighters reinforced this perception. The P-39 Airacobra, with its unconventional mid-mounted engine and tricycle landing gear, proved hopeless at altitude. The engine's supercharger had been deleted in a misguided weight-saving measure, crippling high-altitude performance. The Soviet Union took most P-39 production and used them effectively at low altitude, but German pilots who encountered them over the Eastern Front considered them target practice. The P-40 Warhawk, while rugged, was simply obsolete. A design dating to 1938, outclassed in speed, climb, and maneuverability by every modern German fighter. The P-38 Lightning showed promise with its twin engines and heavy armament, but its size made it unmaneuverable, and early models suffered chronic engine problems in European conditions. Then came the P-47 Thunderbolt in early 1943, and German pilots grudgingly acknowledged American engineering prowess. The P-47 was enormous, 7 tons empty, 9 tons loaded. But its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine delivered 2,000 horsepower, giving it speed and dive performance that caught many German pilots by surprise. It was nearly indestructible, capable of absorbing punishment that would destroy any German fighter. But it was also heavy and unmaneuverable by fighter standards, better suited to hit-and-run attacks than sustained dogfighting. More critically, even with drop tanks, the P-47's combat radius barely reached 375 miles, enough to escort bombers to the German border, but no farther. The Mustang's origins seem to confirm every prejudice. North American aviation had never built a fighter before 1940. When the British Purchasing Commission approached them about building P-40s under license, company president James "Dutch" Kindleberger made an audacious counteroffer. North American could design and build a better fighter in less time than it would take to set up P-40 production. The British, desperate for aircraft as the Battle of Britain raged, agreed. 117 days later, the prototype Nu-73X rolled out. 4 months after that, it flew. Speed was the P-51's birthright. Its laminar flow wing, designed by aerodynamicist Edgar Schmude, featured a revolutionary airfoil shape that maintained smooth airflow over a larger portion of the wing surface, dramatically reducing drag. The fuselage was sculpted with unprecedented attention to aerodynamic cleanliness. No drag-inducing bumps or excrescences, just smooth curves flowing from propeller spinner to tail. Even small details reflected obsessive design discipline. The radiator scoop beneath the fuselage, instead of simply cooling the engine, was designed to use the Meredith effect. Heated air expanding as it passed through the radiator actually produced a small amount of thrust, offsetting the scoop's drag. In testing, the P-51 with its Allison V1710 engine reached 382 miles per hour at 15,000 feet, faster than any contemporary American fighter. But that Allison engine was the Mustang's fatal flaw. Like all Allison V12s, it used a single-stage supercharger, adequate for low-altitude performance but inadequate above 15,000 feet where the air grew thin. As altitude increased, the Allison lost power, and the P-51's impressive speed advantage evaporated. The RAF, receiving its first Mustangs in 1942, assigned them to Army cooperation and tactical reconnaissance, low-altitude missions where the Allison performed adequately. American pilots who flew early Mustangs with the 9th Air Force reported similar experiences. Fast on the deck, sluggish upstairs. German intelligence officers, reading these reports from interrogated prisoners and captured documents, filed the P-51 in the category of specialized low-altitude aircraft, not a threat to bomber escort operations. Luftwaffe pilots who encountered the Allison-powered Mustang over France and Belgium confirmed this assessment. Fast in level flight, yes, but easily outclimbed and outmaneuvered at combat altitudes. Nothing to worry about. They didn't know that across the Atlantic, a small group of engineers and test pilots were conducting experiments that would change everything. The idea was almost comically simple. Take the P-51's superb airframe and marry it to a better engine. The Rolls-Royce Merlin, powering the Spitfire and other British aircraft, featured a 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger that maintained power output even at extreme altitudes. What if you put a Merlin in a Mustang? Ronald Harker, a Rolls-Royce test pilot, flew a Mustang in April 1942 and immediately grasped the potential. His report to Rolls-Royce and the RAF was unequivocal. The Mustang airframe with a Merlin engine would create the best fighter in the world. 5 Mustangs were shipped to Rolls-Royce for conversion. Simultaneously, the USAAF ordered Packard Motor Company, which was already building Merlins under license for British aircraft, to develop an Americanized version. The engineering challenges were significant. The Merlin's mounting points, oil systems, and cooling requirements differed from the Allison's. But by October 1942, both British and American test pilots were flying Merlin-powered Mustangs. The performance gains were staggering. Maximum speed increased from 390 mph. Merlin engine transformed the P-51 from a fast but altitude-limited reconnaissance aircraft into a superlative air superiority fighter. But the most revolutionary improvement was range. The Mustang's clean aerodynamics and efficient laminar flow wing meant it burned less fuel per mile than any comparable fighter. Combined with internal fuel capacity of 269 gallons and provision for 2 external drop tanks, the P-51B could fly missions lasting 6 hours or more. Combat radius with drop tanks, 650 miles, with larger tanks, over 800 miles. In autumn 1943, the first P-51Bs began reaching American fighter groups in England. The 354th Fighter Group, assigned to the 9th Air Force, received theirs in November. Early missions were cautious, feeling out the new fighters' capabilities against experienced German opposition. On December 1, 1943, the 354th escorted bombers to Solingen, 90 miles beyond the previous escort limit. German controllers, tracking the American formation, waited for the escorts to turn back. They kept waiting. The P-51 stayed with the bombers all the way to target and all the way home. On December 13, P-51s escorted bombers to Kiel, a 940-mile round trip. On December 20 to Bremen. On January 11, 1944, to Oschersleben and Halberstadt, deep in central Germany. Each mission pushed farther east. Each mission rewrote the mathematics of aerial warfare. And on each mission, German pilots who rose to intercept the bombers found themselves facing a fighter that could match them in speed, outclimb them at altitude, outturn them in a sustained fight, and most psychologically devastating, choose when to engage and when to break off. The shock rippled through Luftwaffe fighter units like a physical blow. For 2 years, the fundamental defensive strategy against American daylight bombing had relied on one immutable fact: the escorts would leave. German fighters could afford to feint, to wait, to attack after the P-47s turned for home. Now that safety margin was gone. Now the Americans brought their fighters all the way. Berlin, the heart of the Reich, lay within P-51 range. The Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf factories at Leipzig and Regensburg, within range. The synthetic oil plants at Perlitz and Luna, within range. The ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, scene of devastating bomber losses in October 1943, now fully within the P-51's protective umbrella. Worse, from the German perspective, was the P-51's performance envelope. Luftwaffe doctrine emphasized vertical combat, diving attacks from altitude using superior climb and dive performance to engage, disengage, and re-engage at will. The Bf-109 and FW-1 optimized for this style of fighting, but the P-51B could follow them into the dive, climb back up with them, and then turn inside them if they tried to maneuver. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns, while lighter than the 20 and 30 cannon armament of German fighters, fired 3,600 rounds per minute combined. A hailstorm of heavy bullets that could saw wings off or detonate fuel tanks at ranges exceeding 400 yards. American pilots, initially skeptical of the unfamiliar British-designed engine, quickly became believers. The Merlin's power delivery was smooth and predictable. The P-51's handling was crisp without being twitchy, stable without being sluggish. Visibility through the Malcolm hood, and later the bubble canopy, was superb, 360-degree visibility that made it nearly impossible to surprise a vigilant Mustang pilot. And the range, that glorious, unprecedented range, meant pilots could hunt across the whole of German-controlled airspace, seeking targets of opportunity, strafing airfields, turning the Luftwaffe's own tactics against them. But aircraft alone don't win air wars. Pilots matter, tactics matter. And by early 1944, American fighter doctrine was evolving in ways that magnified the P-51's advantages. For the first year of operations, USAAF fighter doctrine had emphasized close escort, fighters staying within visual range of the bombers, reacting to German attacks but never initiating combat. This was defensive, reactive, and played to German strengths. But in January 1944, General James Doolittle, newly appointed commander of the 8th Air Force, issued new orders. Fighters were to seek out and destroy German fighters wherever they could be found. Engage offensively. Hunt aggressively. Don't wait for the Germans to attack the bombers. Attack the Germans before they reach the bombers. The orders transformed the air war's character overnight. P-51 groups began flying ahead of the bomber stream, sweeping approach routes and assembly areas. They attacked German fighters during takeoff and landing, the most vulnerable moments. They strafed airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground. The Germans, accustomed to choosing when and where to fight, suddenly found themselves fighting for survival from the moment their wheels left the runway. Klaus Becker, recovering from his damaged aircraft in close call in January, found February even worse. The Americans were everywhere, not just over the bomber routes but patrolling randomly, barely enough to take off and land, certainly not enough to survive combat against veteran American pilots flying superior aircraft. On February 20, 1944, the USAAF launched Operation Argument, later known as Big Week, a coordinated series of maximum-effort raids against German aircraft production facilities. Over 3,000 bomber sorties, supported by nearly as many fighters, struck targets across the Reich. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them, committing everything available. In 6 days of intense combat, German fighters inflicted heavy losses: 226 American bombers destroyed, 28 damaged beyond repair. But the Luftwaffe's losses were catastrophic. 355 fighters destroyed, 166 damaged, and worst of all, 100 pilots killed and 66 wounded. Pilots. That was the equation's unsolvable term. Germany could build more Messerschmitts, more Focke-Wulfs, more of the new jet-powered Me-262s. But building pilots took time. Time to train, time to learn, time to develop the instincts and skills that separated survivors from casualties. The Luftwaffe had entered the war with perhaps the world's finest fighter pilot training program, a carefully structured system that produced skilled, confident aviators. But by early 1944, that system had collapsed under the weight of losses and fuel shortages. New pilots received abbreviated training, inadequate flight time, and were thrown into combat against Americans who had 6 months or a year of operational experience. The results were predictable and terrible. Becker watched boys die. 18-year-old boys who could barely hold formation, who panicked at the first sight of a P-51, who made the simple mistakes, fixating on a target, flying straight and level for more than 5 seconds, running when they should have turned, turning when they should have run. He tried to teach them, tried to pass along the lessons written in scar tissue and dead friends. But there was never enough time. A new pilot might arrive on Monday and die on Wednesday, and on Friday another fresh-faced boy would sit in the same chair at the same table in the same ready room and ask the same questions. And always there were more Mustangs. By March 1944, the 8th Air Force had 9 fighter groups equipped with P-51s. By April, 12. By June, 15. Nearly 900 Mustangs, a silver swarm that blanketed German skies from dawn to dusk. They flew to Berlin, the Big B, the target everyone had said was impossible, too distant, too deep, to defend their capital, and were slaughtered. 69 Luftwaffe aircraft destroyed, 11 P-51s lost. The mathematics were unsustainable. In March 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 56% of its fighter pilots. In April, 50%. By May, entire Jagdschwader were combat ineffective, reduced to skeleton crews flying worn-out aircraft on minimal fuel. Adolf Galland, commander of the Luftwaffe fighter forces, begged for permission to husband resources, to pull back and rebuild. The request was denied. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring demanded attacks against the bombers at all costs. Every fighter that could fly would fly. Every pilot who could still climb into a cockpit would fight. They fought, and they died. Becker lasted until April. On April 24, 1944, escorting bombers over Friedrichshafen, his swarm, a four-aircraft formation, intercepted a group of P-51s south of Augsburg. The Americans had altitude advantage, diving out of the sun with textbook precision. Becker's wingman died in the first pass, his FW-190 exploding in a fireball that momentarily blinded Becker. The second element scattered. Becker turned into the attack, trying to force an overshoot, but the American, whoever he was, whatever squadron, whatever home state in that vast country across the ocean, stayed glued to his tail. Cannon shells struck Becker's engine. The Focke-Wulf shuddered, hemorrhaging oil and coolant. He dove for the deck, but the P-51 followed him down, firing in controlled bursts. More hits. His right aileron shredded. Control surfaces unresponsive. He bilayed out at 3,000 feet, pulling the ripcord and feeling the parachute crack open with a jolt that dislocated his shoulder. As he drifted down toward Bavarian farmland, watching his aircraft auger into a hillside trailing black smoke, he saw the P-51 circle once, a victory roll perhaps, or just confirmation of the kill, and then climb back toward the bomber stream. Becker survived the war. Many didn't. By June 1944, the Luftwaffe fighter force was a broken instrument, incapable of contesting Allied air superiority over France during the Normandy invasion. By September, American P-51s were ranging across all of Germany, escorting bomber raids to Königsberg. Moved. The Me-262 jet fighter, which could outrun a Mustang by 100 mph, arrived too late and in too few numbers. Fuel shortages grounded thousands of German aircraft. Pilots who had survived 2 years of combat were killed on their last missions by American teenagers flying P-51s who had been in high school when the war began. The final accounting is stark. From January 1944 to May 1945, P-51 Mustangs were credited with destroying 4,950 German aircraft in the air, and another 4,131 on the ground, more than any other Allied fighter type. They escorted bombers on 213 long-range missions, with loss rates for the bombers dropping from 9.2% in October 1943 to less than 2% by mid-1944. The Mustang's kill-to-loss ratio against Luftwaffe fighters exceeded 4:1, despite often fighting outnumbered deep in enemy territory. But statistics don't capture the psychological impact. The Mustang didn't just defeat German fighters, it humiliated them. It took the one advantage German pilots had clung to, the sanctuary of distance, the knowledge that American escorts would eventually turn back, and erased it. It forced the Luftwaffe to fight a war of attrition they couldn't win, bleeding experienced pilots at rates that no training program could replace. It turned German-controlled airspace into a hunting ground where the hunters became prey. In ready rooms and pilot quarters across the Reich, conversations that had once been filled with bravado and confidence turned quiet and fatalistic. Pilots stopped talking about victory and started talking about survival. The laughter that had greeted intelligence reports about the P-51 in 1942 and 1943, that dismissive certainty that American fighters were inferior, that German pilots and German aircraft were simply better, curdled into something else. Not respect exactly. Fear would be too simple a word. Rather, it was the cold recognition of a fundamental shift in the balance of power. The Americans had built a fighter that shouldn't exist, married it to an engine that shouldn't work, and deployed it in numbers that shouldn't be sustainable. And it was winning. There's a photograph, taken in May 1945, that captures something essential about the Mustang's legacy. It shows a long line of P-51s parked on a captured German airfield, their silver skins gleaming in the spring sunlight. In the foreground, a wrecked Messerschmitt Bf-109 lies crumpled against the tree line, its swastika tail marking barely visible beneath mud and carbon. Scoring, the contrast is almost too perfect, too symbolic. The gleaming silver Americans lined up in perfect order, functional and deadly. The broken German, abandoned and forgotten. But there's another detail in that photograph that historians sometimes miss. In the background, blurred but visible, is a group of German civilians, refugees or displaced persons, judging by their bundled possessions and tired postures. They're walking past the aircraft, paying them no attention. The machines that had dominated their lives, filled their skies with thunder and terror, are now just obstacles to walk around. Irrelevant. The war for them is over. The aircraft, German and American alike, are already relics. And perhaps that's the deeper truth about the P-51 Mustang and its victory over the Luftwaffe. It wasn't just a story of one fighter outperforming another. It was a story about industrial capacity and resource allocation and strategic vision. The United States built more than 15,000 Mustangs during the war, 15,000 of a single fighter type, not counting P-47s, P-38s, P-40s, or any of the other types in production. Germany, by comparison, built 34,000 Bf-109s over the entire course of the war, impressive in absolute terms, but spread across 6 years and divided among multiple fronts. American industry could absorb losses and replace them within weeks. German industry, strangled by strategic bombing and raw material shortages, struggled to replace each lost aircraft. The Mustang also embodied a peculiarly American approach to problem solving. Identify the requirement, design to meet that requirement with ruthless pragmatism, and scale production to overwhelming levels. There was nothing exotic about the P-51. Its construction was conventional: aluminum airframe, riveted construction, off-the-shelf components wherever possible. Packard built the Merlin engine on assembly lines in Detroit using mass production techniques borrowed from automotive manufacturing. North American Aviation's factory in Inglewood, California, employed thousands of workers, many of them women, building Mustangs around the clock on assembly lines that would have been equally at home building Buicks or Fords. The Germans built aircraft like Precision Instruments, custom-fitted and hand-assembled by skilled craftsmen. The Americans built aircraft like cars, standardized and interchangeable, designed for rapid production by semi-skilled labor. And behind it all was abundance. Abundance of raw materials, aluminum from American mines and smelters, rubber, abundance of pilots. The USAAF trained more than 193,000 pilots during the war, drawing from a population of 130 million. Abundance of resources to support those pilots: mechanics, armorers, fuel trucks, ammunition, spare parts, all flowing across the Atlantic in quantities that seemed impossible to German logisticians accustomed to rationing every liter of fuel and every 20 shell. The P-51 Mustang was, in this sense, more than a fighter aircraft. It was a weapon of abundance, a manifestation of American industrial might and organizational capacity wielded against an enemy who had mastered the art of war but never fully grasped the science of logistics. German pilots were skilled, often superlatively so. German aircraft designers were innovative and bold. German tactics were honed by years of combat experience. But none of it mattered against an enemy who could field 15,000 Mustangs, train the pilots to fly them, fuel them, arm them, and maintain them in the field, all while simultaneously building heavy bombers and transport aircraft and warships and tanks and trucks, and everything else a modern military machine required. Klaus Becker, in his post-war interviews, never spoke bitterly about the Mustang. He didn't claim it was an unfair advantage, or that American pilots were lesser adversaries who relied on superior numbers. Instead, he talked about inevitability, about watching the American formations grow larger month by month, watching the escorts penetrate deeper and deeper into the Reich, watching the Luftwaffe's defensive perimeter contract like a dying star collapsing in on itself. He talked about knowing, somewhere around February or March of 1944, that the war was lost, even though it would drag on for another 15 months of blood and fire. The Mustang hadn't just defeated the Luftwaffe. It had proven that Germany's war was unwinnable, that the Reich had challenged adversaries with resources and industrial capacity, so vast that military skill alone couldn't bridge the gap. On a warm evening in May 1945, as the last guns fell silent across Europe, a P-51 pilot named Robert Johnson landed at a liberated airfield in Bavaria. He'd flown 261 combat missions, survived being shot down twice, and seen too many friends die in aircraft that should have brought them home safely. After shutdown checks, he climbed out of his Mustang and stood on the wing for a moment, looking at the aircraft that had kept him alive through 2 years of war. Someone had painted a name on the nose, Ridge Runner III. The first 2 Ridge Runners had been shot out from under him. This one, many times the original paint was invisible beneath layers of fresh aluminum and drab olive, had brought him home. A German mechanic, a former Luftwaffe technician now working for the occupying forces, approached Johnson and asked if he could look at the aircraft. Johnson nodded. The German walked slowly around the Mustang, running his hand along the wing's leading edge, examining the gun ports, studying the engine cowling. Finally, he spoke in halting English. "We heard stories about this airplane. We didn't believe them. We thought American aircraft were." He paused, searching for the word, schwer, heavy like the thunderbolt, but this. He tapped the fuselage. "This is a good airplane." Johnson didn't know what to say to that. Good seemed like an inadequate word for an aircraft that had rewritten the rules of aerial warfare. But maybe that was the point. The P-51 Mustang wasn't a miracle or a secret weapon or the product of some incomprehensible technological leap. It was just a good airplane, well-designed, efficiently built, properly deployed, produced in the quantities and time frame that only an industrial democracy at full mobilization could manage. That mechanic, that anonymous German technician standing on a conquered airfield, represented the millions who'd laughed when they first heard about the P-51, laughed at the idea that the Americans could build a fighter to match the Messerschmitt, laughed at the reports of long-range escorts, laughed because laughter was easier than confronting the possibility that they'd misjudged their opponent's capacity for innovation and adaptation. But by May 1945, there was no laughter left. Only the silence of abandoned airfields and wrecked aircraft and the distant hum of Merlin engines as P-51s patrolled skies that no longer needed patrolling. The war in Europe had ended not with a dramatic final duel or a heroic last stand, but with exhaustion and collapse, and the slow recognition that the mathematics had always been against them. In the end, the P-51 Mustang didn't just outrun the Messerschmitt. It outlasted it, outproduced it, outorganized and outresourced and outsustained the entire system that had created the Messerschmitt. It proved that in industrial warfare, quality matters, but quantity has a quality all its own. And when you achieve both, when you build a fighter that's better than the enemy's best and build it in numbers the enemy can't match, you don't just win battles. You win wars. The legacy endures in unexpected ways. Decades after the war, elderly Luftwaffe veterans would gather at reunions and airshows, sharing stories and memories smoothed by time. Inevitably, conversations would turn to aircraft, to which type was fastest or most maneuverable or best looking. And inevitably, someone would mention the Mustang. The reminiscences that followed were always tinged with a kind of rueful admiration. They'd faced Spitfires and Yaks and Thunderbolts, but the Mustang was different. The Mustang was the one that took away their home field advantage, that hunted them over their own territory, that made every flight a desperate gamble for survival. "We laughed at it," one veteran confessed in an interview filmed in the 1970s. "When we first heard about the Mustang, we laughed. We thought it was just another American attempt to copy German engineering. But they didn't copy us. They built something new, something we couldn't answer. And by the time we understood what we were facing, it was too late. Too late. Two words that echo across the history of the air war in Europe. Too late to adapt tactics. Too late to develop countermeasures. Too late to train replacement pilots. Too late to reverse the industrial and strategic realities that the P-51's appearance had merely made visible. The Luftwaffe hadn't lost the war because of the Mustang, but the Mustang had accelerated the loss, transformed it from a theoretical possibility into a material certainty, made it impossible to pretend that skill and courage could substitute for fuel and factories and the unglamorous logistics of modern war. There's no monument to the P-51 Mustang that captures this truth adequately. There are preserved aircraft in museums, gleaming under artificial lights, their Merlin engines silent, their guns empty. There are memorials to the men who flew them, granite markers inscribed with names and dates. But the real memorial is subtler, harder to see. It exists in the post-war order, in the recognition that air power and industrial capacity are inseparable, that control of the skies determines what's possible on the ground. That distance is no defense against an adversary with the resources to project power across continents. The German pilots who laughed at the P-51 weren't fools. They were products of their experience, trained in a system that emphasized individual skill and tactical excellence. They defeated every opponent they'd faced through superior aircraft and superior training and superior leadership. Their laughter was the laughter of men who believed they were the best in the world at what they did. And they were, for a time. But the Mustang taught them, taught everyone, that being the best isn't enough when your adversary can field good enough in quantities that overwhelm quality. It taught them that wars are won not just in the cockpit but in the factory, not just in tactical combat but in strategic vision, not just by brave men, but by the economic and industrial